Hi, Mom. I'm back again to read to you. I hope you're having a great time in Australia and good weather. I'm trying to get some reading in because I know you have your vacation coming up with Peter and Marnie. I'm going to be on the road. I'm not quite sure when that'll happen, but I'll talk to you sometime this weekend. So I'll read maybe one or two more chapters of St. Teresa of Avila's The Book of My Life. And right now it is chapter 25, Spiritual Voices. At this juncture, it would be a good idea to explain what happens when the soul hears spiritual voices and how they make her feel. Ever since the Lord first granted me this favor, it has become a very common experience for me. Although we do not hear the words with our physical ears, they are so distinct that we understand them with absolute clarity. In fact, we could not resist hearing and understanding them even if we tried with all our might to shut them out. Here on earth, we do not want to listen to something. We can stick our fingers in our ears or focus our attention on something else so that even if we hear the words, we do not understand them. But when God speaks directly to the soul, she has no choice. Even if I wanted to avoid what God has to say, He makes me listen to Him, and He sharpens my mind so that I clearly understand what He wants me to understand. It doesn't matter whether I'm trying to understand or not. God wants us to realize that He is all-powerful. God is our Supreme Lord. I have a lot of experience with this matter because I struggled for 2 years to resist these experiences and I couldn't do it. I still try sometimes and I still can't do it. There is a danger of becoming deluded here. Only a very experienced spiritual practitioner is safe from delusions. In general, there are 3 different sources of spiritual voices: the Spirit of God, the Spirit of evil, and our own minds. Then there is another kind of voice, which is the Spirit speaking to itself. I'm not sure how this last experience works, but it occurs to me today that it would be possible. I have a great deal of experience with the voices that come from God. Many of the things He said to me came true after 2 or 3 years. So far, nothing I have heard has turned out to be a lie. Sometimes when a person approaches God with great love and lays a certain request at His feet, the intensity of her feeling might lead her to imagine that she hears His response to her prayer. But it is quite possible that she is correct. But anyone who has experienced genuine spiritual voices will easily be able to hear the difference between words that come from her own mind and those that come from the Spirit of God. If the message is something the intellect has fabricated, no matter how subtle it may be, an experienced person will know that the mind is composing and conveying it. The main difference is that in one case the words are contrived and in the other they are simply heard. The intellect will recognize that it's not really listening because it's too busy making things up. The words it puts together sound muffled and vague. They do not carry the clarity and authority of a true spiritual voice. In this case, we have just as much power to shift our attention away from the content of our own minds as we do to keep quiet when we no longer want to hear the sound of ourselves talking. When the words come from God, it is impossible to divert our attention. A more obvious sign that the voice is coming from our own minds is that the words have no lasting effect. The words come from God are both words and works. What I mean is that even when the words are critical rather than devotional, they cultivate the soul and make her grow. They bless her and give her light. They move the soul to a place of deep tenderness and quietude. If the soul has been suffering from agitation and aridity, it feels like God is liberating her from all her worries with a wave of His hand. He seems to be proving to her that He is all-powerful and that His words are works. It seems to me that the difference between a true spiritual voice and an intellectual one is no more and no less than the difference between listening and speaking. When I'm talking, I am arranging what I'm going to say in my mind. But when someone else is talking to me, all I have to do is listen without any effort. With an intellectual voice, we can't be sure if the words are really spoken. We hear them the way someone who is half asleep will hear the conversation in a room where she is lying down. When the voice comes from God, it is so clear that we don't miss a single syllable. We often hear true spiritual voices when our souls and our minds are so agitated and distracted that we couldn't succeed in stringing together a coherent sentence if we tried. Yet here are these elaborate discourses fully prepared and handed to us, speeches we could not possibly have written even in our clearest state of consciousness, and at the sound of the first word, the soul is utterly transformed. How could the soul suddenly understand things that had never even crossed her mind before, especially when she is enraptured? How can she apprehend these things when the faculties are suspended and the imagination is dazed? I like to make something clear. The soul does not see visions or hear spiritual voices when she is actually in the midst of a rapture. During rapture, all the faculties are completely lost, and in my opinion, we can't see or hear or even understand a thing. The soul is completely under the power of another. The beloved gives her no freedom at all. This sort of total absorption doesn't last long, however. It is after the intensity of the rapture has passed, but while the soul is still transported, that the voices come. Even though the faculties are starting to come back, they are barely functional. They certainly aren't capable of putting sentences together. There are so many ways to tell the difference between a voice that comes from God and one that conjured up by our own intellect that we have no reason to be fooled more than once. There are many ways to tell the difference between a voice that comes from God and one conjured up by our own intellect that we have no reason to be fooled more than once. I mean, if a soul is experienced and vigilant, she will easily be able to distinguish between them. Not only do the voices come from the intellect fail to produce any lasting effects, but the discerning soul has trouble believing them. They sound like nonsense to her. She doesn't take them any more seriously than she would take the ravings of a lunatic. When the voices come from God, on the other hand, they have lasting effects, whether the soul consciously acquiesces to them or not. When we hear a true spiritual voice, we experience it as though we were listening to the teachings of a very holy person or a great sage who would never lie to us. The voice bears absolute authority. This analogy is still inadequate, for the words carry such majesty that even if we do not know who is speaking them, we tremble if they are words of reproach, and we melt if they are words of love. The sentences are so complex and are spoken so quickly that we never would have had time to compose them ourselves. There is no reason for me to dwell on this any longer. Suffice it to say that an experienced person is not likely to be deceived unless she wants to be deceived. It is impossible to doubt a spiritual voice when it is happening. It is only afterward that I have sometimes wondered if I made it up. But then later I discover that what I heard has turned out to be true. The Lord imprints the words on our memory so that we cannot forget what He has said. However, the voices that come from our own minds are like the first stirrings of a thought. They pass before they are fully formed. A divine voice may fade over a long period of time, but never so completely that we lose the substance of what we heard. When the voice conveys a particular teaching or bestows a favor, we may not retain the details, but if it takes the form of prophecy, in my opinion, it is impossible to forget. At least this is the case for me, and I have a terrible memory. It would be extremely wicked for someone to claim that she has heard a divine voice when she has not, but it would be impossible for the soul not to realize whether a voice is an artifact of her own mind and does not originate from the Spirit of God. Otherwise, she might spend her whole life laboring under the illusion that she knows something that she does not know. How could she? Either her soul wants to understand, or she doesn't. So the soul tries to push away what she's hearing because it scares her, or maybe she has convinced herself that silent prayer is the only valid spiritual practice. So she rejects all the language and all concepts. Then how could the intellect possibly have the freedom to make up these sacred speeches? Such things take much more time than the soul has allowed herself. The voices that come from God instruct us in a flash. We instantly realize things that would take us a month to put into words. The intellect and the soul herself, are amazed at what they understand. This is the way it is. Anyone who has experienced it will know that what I am saying is literally true. I praise God for giving me the ability to describe it this way. I'll just wrap this up by saying that I think we can create intellectual voices whenever we want. Every time we sit in prayer, we might talk ourselves into believing that we are hearing the words of God, but we cannot make God speak to us. Sometimes I spend many days hoping to hear the voice of God, and nothing comes. Then at other times, when I don't want to hear a spiritual voice, I'm suddenly given direct knowledge of divine things. It seems to me that someone who has not had this experience might try to mislead others into thinking that he understands something that he could not possibly understand. The big clue that it is not a true spiritual voice is that, if pressed, the person will report that he heard it with his physical ears. I never knew there was any other way to hear things either until I experienced it myself, and hearing in this other way has created severe trials for me. When the voices come from the spirit of evil, not only do they fail to create any positive results, but they leave negative effects in their wake. I have only experienced these voices 2 or 3 times, and on each occasion God gave me ample warning ahead of time. Not only do these diabolical voices dry out the soul, but they also leave her terribly disquieted. I have experienced aridity and disquiet many times after the Lord has given me severe temptations and spiritual trials. This kind of inner turmoil still plagues me on a regular basis, but I understand where it comes from. The agitation that accompanies a voice from the spirit of evil is different. The soul intuitively resists it. She feels troubled and upset without knowing why. But I'll tell you why. It's because what the spirit of evil says to her is bad, not good. I wonder if one spirit doesn't detect the presence of the other. The sense of consolation and delight the spirit of evil gives to the soul is very different from what she receives from the voice of God. But if someone had not experienced an authentic spiritual voice, she might easily be deluded by these false messages. The consolations that come from God are deeply pleasurable. They are gentle and refreshing, simultaneously intense and quiet. Little bursts of religious emotion, sometimes accompanied by tears, are evidence of a good beginning, but they do not constitute true devotion. At the first mild breeze of persecution, these blessings drop their tiny blossoms. They don't do much to help the soul distinguish between the effects of a good spirit and a bad one. Mom, I'm going to stop here because I forgot to plug in the headset, so I'm not sure if this is recording the audio since I've been having some problems with my old computer here. So I'm going to pause. We're at the top of page 187, and if it does work, I will create a new video and start at the second paragraph on page 187. All right, love you. See you in a bit.